Have you ever looked at one of those read through the Bible in a year plans? You know, you kind of get a layout of them, and they have 2 or 3 different chapters each day that you read. Well, if you look closely at it, January 1st, you start off in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. You don't get to the end of Malachi, which is the tail end of the Old Testament, until October 13th. Yeah. I was curious this week because I read through the Bible, and I'm in Psalms right now. Actually, Psalm 22. Psalm 23 is today. And I was looking through and I'm like, I wonder, when is it that I'm going to get into the New Testament? I'm craving some New Testament stuff. God kind of taught me a little lesson here. And much to my surprise, that I'm not going to get into the whole New Testament until October 14th. And it's only about 2.5 months that I'll be in the New Testament. I wonder how much we leave on the ground by focusing on certain books of the Bible like Genesis or the beginning part of Exodus or Psalms and Proverbs, the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. I wonder how many good nuggets we're leaving in the scriptures because we try to focus entirely on the New Testament. With that said, we're going to be in Romans 7, 1 to 12. And ironically enough, we're talking about the law today. So if you would, follow along with me. We're going to be in Romans 7, starting in verse 1. We'll go through verse 12. It'll be up on the board, or you can follow along in your Bible. Since I am speaking to those who understand law, brothers, are you unaware that the law has authority over someone as long as he lives? For example, a married woman is legally bound to her husband while he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law regarding the husband. So then, if she gives herself to another man while her husband is living, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. Then, if she gives herself to another man, she is not an adulteress. Therefore, my brothers, you also were put to death in relation to the law through the crucified body of the Messiah, so that you may belong to another, to him who is raised from the dead, that we may bear fruit for God. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions operated through the law in every part of us and bore fruit for death. But now we have been released from the law, since we have died to what held us, so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old letter of the law. What should we say then? Is the law sin? Absolutely not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin if it were not for the law. For example, I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." And sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. The commandment that was meant for life resulted in death for me. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and just, and good. See, today we're talking about freedom. We're talking about how we are free from the law. And in this first little verse of chapter 7, Paul says, since I am speaking to those who understand law, brothers, are you unaware that the law has authority over someone as long as he lives? This, my friends, is why we must die to the law. We have to die to the law so that we can be freed from sin and death's constant control, like we've talked about in weeks past. You see, before we came to Christ, we had this sin and death had this constant control over us. We lived in an unchecked reality where sin and death reigned, and there was nothing there to check it. Well, now that we've come to Christ, he's explained that sin no longer rules over us, and that we are not slaves of sin and death, but now that we are slaves of Jesus Christ. Okay? That's what we talked about last week. This week, he's going to explain how we've died to the law. Okay? And the reason we must die to the law is to be freed from sin and death's constant control. So, while we live, the law has the authority over us. Okay? What does that mean? Well, he goes on to explain this in verses 2 and 3. He says, for example, a married woman is legally bound to her husband while he lives. True enough statement, right? When a man and woman get married, they are legally bound. Not just, and don't think of laws in the United States law. We're talking about God's law here, okay? There is a United States law precedent that has to be talked about, but that's a different subject. A man and woman get married in the eyes of God. Once they, to sanitize it for the children in the room, once they unite, they are married, which is why sex before marriage is denied. You're essentially married to that person once that act is complete. Okay, so in a sense, you're married to that person, and when they unite, that God's law binds them together. Okay, and they are man and wife. Okay, so while they are both living, they're bound to each other. Okay. But if her husband dies, or if the husband dies, or if the woman dies, she is released from the law regarding the husband. So if one of the spouses die, the law, God's law regarding those spouses is null and void. Why? Because one of them's gone. Death has broken the bonds of the... Death has broken the law of the chains that have bonded them together. Okay? Death is the only thing that can release that. So then, if she gives herself to another man while her husband is still living, she's called an adulteress. Okay? Which is why in Matthew and in the Gospels, Jesus says, any man that has... it's talking about, oh man, it's on the tip of my tongue. He's talking about divorce, and he says that when a man gives his wife a divorce decree and sends her away, if she marries another man, she's committing adultery, is essentially what he's saying. So as long as both of them are still living, she goes to another man, then she's called an adulteress, okay? But if her husband dies, she is free from that law. Then if she gives herself to another man, she's not an adulteress. So when a widow remarries, that's not adultery. She's just getting remarried. Okay? Trust me, that's a hard pill for me to swallow because I'm divorced. You know, I mean, that's just, it's one of those things that, you know, I mean, it's kind of a hard pill to swallow. You know, I mean, now naturally that was before I was baptized, but still, I mean, it still has, you know, it still weighs on you. But that's kind of the law regarding this, and he's trying to relate this situation from marriage. The marriage isn't what the real issue is here. The real issue is the marriage that we have to the law. Okay? He moves on in verse 4. He says, therefore, there's that therefore, my brothers, you also were put to death in relation to the law through the crucified body of the Messiah, so that you may belong to another, to him who is raised from the dead, that we may bear fruit for God. You see, in a sense, we were married to the law. Whether we realize it or not, see, we're married to the law. You see, when you go through the Bible, it's the Old Testament and the New Testament. And actually, that word for testament is better translated covenant. That's what a marriage is. A marriage is a covenant bond between a man and a woman. A marriage is a covenant between the law and humankind. Okay? So, that's what a marriage is a covenant. He says, when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions operated through the law in every part of us and bore fruit for death. But now we have been released from the law, since we have died to what held us, so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old letter of the law. You see, we've now been released from our first husband. Okay? We've been released from our first husband, which is the law, through death. And now we are free to remarry our new husband, Jesus Christ. You see, when we come to Jesus in faith, the covenant between humankind and the law is broken. It's broken. And where it's broken, it can only be broken by death. So as we've talked about, like chapter 3, and I think it's chapter 3 and 4 in Romans, we talk about how when we are in Christ, we die as we go under the water, and we are raised to new life. We've died. That is a symbolism of us identifying to the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So we have died to that law. And therefore, because we've died to that law, you see, if we're still under the law, and we're still, quote, married to the law, we can't go and marry Jesus. We can't make another covenant. That old covenant has to be broken in order for us to remarry into a new one. That's what Jesus does. He comes so that we can die to the old way of things and be raised and free to marry him. Because we are called the bride of Christ, the church. And he says that so that we can, and this second part of verse 6 is a big part of this. He says, so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old letter of the law. So, we serve according to the Spirit instead of following the rule of law, like the Old Testament. Verse 7, he says, what should we say then? Is the law sin? Well, no, absolutely not. On the contrary, he says, I would not have known sin if it were not for the law. For example, I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. You see, the law helps us to know what sin is. The law itself is not sin. The law is not sin. Sin is sin. The law gives light to what sin is. So in the Old Testament, when it says, you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not commit murder, you shall not covet your neighbor's possessions. It's instead of a list of you shall not, this is a list of this is what sin is. Okay? This defines what sin is. Okay? Verse 8. Let me read this before I go into it. And sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. This is the power of suggestion. This is why it is absolutely vital to mind what our eyes take in, what our ears hear, who we spend time with, and mind what we do. Because the power of suggestion is huge. The law came along, and Paul's going to get into this here in a second, but the law came along, and the power of suggestion, oh my gosh. You shall have no other gods before me. Well, what did they do? almost immediately afterwards, they built themselves calves, and after David and Solomon reigned, Rehoboam came in and reigned, and Jeroboam said, no, I don't like that, and the kingdom split into Judah and Israel, and Jeroboam, instead of serving Israel and serving Yahweh, he makes these golden calves that Aaron made eons in the past, and they serve these two golden calves. They serve Baal, they serve Molech, they serve any kind of god they can get their hands on other than the true one. You see, my friends, the power of suggestion is way more powerful than what we give it credit for. I hate using myself all the time, but it's the best example I know. Sherry and I get called stuffy or anal or prudish, because there are certain things that we will not do. Just won't do it. Why? It's not because we think we're better than everybody else. It's because of that right there. It's because the power of suggestion is horrible. I get on my kids all the time about listening to the garbage that's on the radio. You have no idea of the crap that you're putting in your head. I mean, we hear this stuff, and it's in my own life. The reason I've cut this stuff out is because it's the power of suggestion in me that causes me to fall away. If I don't mind what I'm doing, what my eyes are taking in, what my ears are hearing, who I'm spending time with, and what I'm doing, that's going to take over. The power of suggestion is going to take over, and sin is going to absolutely reign in my life. It's not that we think we're better than everybody else. I know my flesh, and I know the temptations that are there. We were talking in Sunday school this morning. For me, technology is a huge vice. And I love that phone because I have my Bible at my fingertips. We've got a calendar that spans all four of us, so we know each one of us has an appointment. But that thing is also one of the biggest vices I've got. Because there's also video games on there and YouTube. It's horrible. I mean, our contract's up in another year, and I am this close to going back to a flip phone.
If they make them.
I know, if they make them. But it's the power of suggestion. I mean, if something is a vice, you separate yourself from that vice. It's not that it's not that anybody's better than anybody else. It's the fact that I know that my sinful flesh is going to try and take over, and it's going to wreak havoc in my life. If you struggle with addictive tendencies, avoid things that are going to be addictive. Alcohol, food. You mind what you do. Food's another. Food's definitely a vice.
I want to be healthy, but
it is so hard. But more than anything else, the power of suggestion is huge, and that's what it's kind of what happened with the law. The law spelled out what sin is, and it went through 463 of these do's and don'ts. And what did it do? It put the power of suggestion in their mind, and they went and broke every single one of them. Just the way it is. It's terrible. It is absolutely hard. My friends, that is why we have to die to the law. We have to die to it. Because otherwise it's going to continue to have that power over us. The law is how we know what sin is. But the power of suggestion is not the only place where sin comes from. It's not only from the power of suggestion, because the human capacity to invent new evil, pretty good. Because we've got several great examples, like Adam and Eve in the garden, Cain murdering Abel, Joseph's brother selling him out into slavery. Take any number of things happening around. England, the terrorist attacks last night. The human capacity to invent new kinds of evil and destroy. The human capacity it's corrupt. It is absolutely corrupt. And when we do not follow Jesus, that sinful nature is going to take over. And it is going to wreak havoc in our lives. Verses 9 and 10, he moves on. Now it's the last part of 8. He says, "For apart from the law, sin is dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died." The commandment that was meant for life resulted in death for me. You see, the commandments were intended for us to see how to live life. The commandments and the law are not there, as I said earlier, they're not there for a list of do's and don'ts. They're there for a way to see how life should be. And when you take into account all 463 of these laws, oh, what a way of life it is. I mean, the poor are taken care of. You've got situations where, there are purity laws. Well, that's just nothing more than personal hygiene. You touch blood, yeah, you're going to want to make sure that you're sterile and clean before you touch anything else, because that's how diseases spread. The life is in the blood. So, all of these laws, I mean, what a way of life it truly is. Verse 11, he says, "For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me." You see, the commandments were intended for us to see how to live life, but instead, it produced death as sin deceivingly sprang up and used the opportunity, which killed us. Sin pops up deceivingly using the law and passes it off as though the law itself is what is bad. Ooh, how sneaky and tricky that little sinful nature is. Yeah, no. It's not the law that's evil. It's the sin itself that's evil. And who's the father of all deceivers? Well, yeah, he's the great deceiver. It's Satan. He'll weasel his way in there and try and deceive his way in and try and make the things of God seem like they're evil. But it's not the ways of God that are evil. It's the sin and the death and Satan. And, it's him and his little minions. No, not that kind of minion. Verse 12. "So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good." The law is what's holy. The commandment is just and good and holy. You see, as we come back and make full circle here into our faith, righteousness, and obedience, we don't add anything to it this week other than the fact that this, all of this to talk about the law, all of this to talk about how we need to be set free from the law, to say this: in order to go through the process of sanctification, we need to be freed to walk in a new way. We've been talking about this idea of being freed from sin and death and being freed from all of this stuff. We've kind of been on this kick the past few weeks that we've been in Romans. But this is why. This is why, because in order to go through this process of sanctification, faith, righteousness, and obedience, and and the idea of justification, sanctification, and glorification, it's in order to go through this process of sanctification, we have got to be freed from all of the old garbage. We cannot move forward until we do, and that is why Bill's sermon last week was where it was. I had two places that I could put it, and I put it last week because it fit. And if you haven't seen it, I'm going to get the video up on Facebook, and so you can see what Bill's talking about, because what he has to say is absolutely vital to the rest of Romans, because we cannot go through the process of sanctification if we do not let the past go. Can't do it. We cannot do it. We have to be free to walk in a new way. You see, now that we know we've been saved, now that we know that we've got our attitude correct, we continue, last week we talked about this attitude adjustment, in as far as sanctification, not last week, 2 weeks ago. The attitude adjustment by seeing, we continue this idea of adjusting our attitude. And this week we see how it is that we've been set free to walk in this new way of life. How have we been set free? We've been set free through the blood of Jesus Christ. You see, we're free from sin and death by being released from the law, so that we can walk in a new way of life in Jesus. I started this whole process of sanctification off with that statement. Walk in a new way of life. And that's truly, essentially what it's all about. It's about walking in a new way of life. When you come to Jesus, are there things you're going to have to give up? Yes and no. There are so many things that I used to absolutely relish in that I don't have any desire to be a part of anymore. I just don't. As you walk, God is gonna take you through the process of dealing with this stuff. If only we would let him. You see, like we've died to the law, sin, and death of the past, we have to, like we've died to the law, we have to die to sin and death, and we have to die to our past as well in order to be able to walk forward anew with Jesus. We've been freed from the law, we've been freed from sin and death, and you have been freed from your past to walk anew with him. If we're ever going to walk this walk of sanctification, we have to get our attitude correct about the law, sin, and death, and about our past. And that's what Bill touched on last week. We have to be set free from our past. We have to go through the process of coming to terms with it. I mean, there's any number of ways to describe it. I'm kind of failing for words here, but you deal with your past. You go through, and these triggers is what I call them. These triggers that bring up past situations, and like Bill talked about, you get these situations that come up. Well, if you reacted in a certain way the last time, you're going to react that way again because it worked the last time, sinful or not. I mean, you're just going to react that way. And if that way is, quote, working for you, you're going to continue in it, even if it does cause destruction. The only way to let go of that is to let go of the past and realize that you have the power to change that. Change the way you've responded to that. You can change your response. When you change the way you think about that past experience, the way you respond will be different. See it in a positive light instead of a negative light, Oh man, I don't know. I mean, it's any number of possibilities. Divorce. If your parents are divorced, and you see that as a huge negative in your life. Well, yeah, it can be a negative in your life, but it can also be a positive in your life too. Because, I mean, think of this. My parents, for example, my goodness, the last 3 or 4 years of their marriage was terrible. I mean, it was constant fighting and bickering, and it was awful. Now, the new way of life was a complete readjustment after they got divorced, but man, it was so much more peaceful. So we have to change the way we think about it, and there's more to it than just that, but we have to change the way we think about these things. You have been set free from the law, sin, death, and you have been set free from your past so that it doesn't have to dictate who you are. Your past does not have to dictate who you are. You have the freedom to walk anew with him and serve in the new way instead of in the old letter of the law. And you serve in the new way, well, that's according to the Spirit, according to the last part of verse 6. So that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old letter of the law. You see, just like a spouse is set free, this is the big idea for today. Just like a spouse is set free from marriage vows when the other spouse dies, so we are free from the law, from sin, and from death, including our past, to walk and serve in the Spirit of a new way of life. Next week is dare I say, the big one. It's next week we're gonna confront Romans 7:19 to 21. The big old, it's gonna be 13 through 25, but next week is it's what I call the battle of the flesh versus the Spirit. It is this war that wages in us. And if you feel like you are at war with yourself, you are. And you're not alone. Trust me in that. You are not alone. Because it is a battle every single day. And it is a battle we must stay vigilant to. And we'll get into that more next week. But we have to let go of our past. And we cannot, literally, this is literally the stopping point where we cannot move forward in sanctification until we let go of the past. We can't. We have to let go of the past, because if we try to move on from here, it's kind of like a boomerang effect. You can try and cast that boomerang down into the future, and it's going to come back and hit you upside the head. I mean, it really is.
Spiritual 2x4.
Yeah, spiritual 2x4. You can try and move on, but it will have the boomerang effect on you. And dare I say that next week's going to explain that boomerang effect never really goes away. I'm sorry. But that's why Ephesians, when we talked about last year, we went through the book of Ephesians. I love how all these books kind of tie together. It's great. But the armor of God. That's why we put on the armor of God. It is to protect ourselves from that boomerang effect of Romans 7. Because it happens. It'll come back, and it'll come back when you least expect it. Always does.
Isn't it also, when you deal with the past and the baggage that you carry forward, isn't it a better way is to acknowledge the past and to acknowledge what's gone on in your past in order to be able to...
Absolutely. If you're in denial of your past, we have to acknowledge that it's there first. That's the first step in moving forward, is to acknowledge that it's there. Because if we're living in denial, you won't be able to move. It'll eat you alive. And Sherry,
Guess what? Everybody has past.
well, and that's just it. I guess that's the point I'm trying to get across here, is that everybody battles with this. Even if you think you're alone, you're not. You are not alone in this battle. This is a battle that we all fight, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. We are all in that battle. Everybody has got something that's got a boomerang effect to them that always comes back at the least opportune times. We all battle it. And whether or not we all, to tie this into an invitation, whether we realize it or not, whether you are Jewish or not, or Hebrew or not, we're all under the law. Now, if you've been baptized into Jesus Christ, you've died to that law. And you are now set free from that law, and you are now free from that law. But whether the biggest misconception in our culture today is that we think that our belief changes things. No, it doesn't. Whether we realize it or not, we all at one point have been under the law or not. The only thing that makes a difference is Jesus Christ. He's the only thing that can break that bond, because he's the only one that you can identify with in death, burial, and resurrection. If you would, stand with me, sing a hymn of invitation, If you need prayer